We are in Seoul with Mico Matsumura, and you and I last got caught up in Puerto Rico and then briefly in San Francisco.
Yes.
We never realized we'd be here, but here we are. And I'm with Yongsuk Park, one of the great connectors of Korea and blockchain. And Mico, blockchain is all about decentralization. And when you and I last talked, you had a really interesting point, which was the world had passed through peak centralization maybe a couple decades ago, and we've been on this long path towards re-engineering the economy and re-engineering how the political world works, of which blockchain is an example of that. And I'd love you to kind of expand on that thesis, because I think there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, so I'm inspired a bit by the Hirschberg curve, right, which is this construct of like peak oil, right?
Yeah.
So really, when we look at centralization, really, I think there was a magic moment on September 15th of 2008, which is the collapse of Lehman Brothers, right? Which is in a way all the downstream of that, the 12 trillion USD in money printing, $10 trillion of negative yielding bonds, 653 interest rate adjustments. Like, we're far into a neverland of post-collapse, right? So, there are arguments that the beginning of decentralization happened with the first wave of the internet, but regardless, I think the pendulum is naturally swinging back towards equilibrium, because I think that we are in a status of, banks that are too big to fail, and collusion with government, and, the interpenetration of Goldman Sachs into the administration. So, I think that the world has seen the limits, the fundamental limits of centralized power. And I think that we're really starting to now see a technological response, right? Open source money is starting to drive a completely new ethos, and that, I think, is almost a force of nature.
I mean, you could argue that the industrial era, or really everything from the Enlightenment until recently, was about central institutions. That's how growth happened, decisions were made top-down, schools were that way, governments were that, and it worked pretty well until it stopped working so well. And then we suddenly stopped losing trust in these institutions. And then we had kind of a series of more complex problems for which smaller, real-time distributed things made better sense, right? And so, we saw that with the microprocessor, we saw that with the personal computer, and but it is true that kind of like all at once, big institutions we lost faith in, of which the financial crisis was probably the biggest example of that.
Absolutely, and it brings us to this concept of absolute power, corrupting absolutely, which is really kind of ultimately one of the deeper problems, which is that what we don't have underpinning those systems is proper governance, and we don't have governance that's essentially driven by code and mathematics in a completely clean and predictable way, right? So I think what we're emergent into is now protocol, right? So protocol is now essentially deterministically providing governance for an alternative financial infrastructure. So I think that's where the leading edge is, and that's where I think the most excitement is, because it's providing essentially the first viable alternative. So I want to emphasize that people talk about, and possibly incorrectly, about this concept of fiat money, right? And if you think about what fiat means because I said so, right? And I think the thing that people mistake is they say that the contrast is cryptocurrency. I actually believe that I'd like to prefer to call it consensus money, because fiat money is because I said so. Consensus money is because we said so, right? It's the first time that it's been available that we can all agree on what happened, right? If you go into the Bitcoin blockchain, you have trillions of dollars of transactions. There's 0 people on Earth that can point to a single transaction and say that's not what happened. And yet there's no controller, right? There's no bank, there's no government, there's no authority. We said that is the truth, right?
Well, we're really talking about almost reinventing or reconceiving democratic principles, because kind of coded in what you said is we all get to have a say. So there's a little bit of direct democracy in there, but there's also a little bit of voting on protocols, which is not direct. And also encoded in there is the sense that, well, we liked democracy, but the old, slow, centralized things we don't trust, they didn't deliver that too good.
Absolutely. And I think that the definitions of we are being played with, right? So for example, if you look at Bitcoin, we aren't all miners. I'm not a miner, I don't know if you guys are miners, but most of us are not miners, right? So people are playing with that. If you look at something like EOS, there's kind of this DPoS system where people are kind of becoming a part of a staking mechanism, and then they're voting for different kinds of essentially master nodes. But ultimately we're trying to define who the we is. But I think that the base inspiration that Satoshi Nakamoto produced is the ability to even have a we, right? Because prior there was actually no way for two parties to even agree on something. So you had to go with fiat. Fiat was your only choice. And now we have an opportunity to create a we, and we don't know who the we is yet. But we're starting to try to define a we that truly is optimally decentralized. At the moment, even Bitcoin is not optimally decentralized, as many people have pointed out.
It is worth pointing out that the Federalist Papers were all about trying to figure out who we was and then encode it in a system.
I love that. That's a bit, we the people, it's definitely goes all the way back.
Also centralized and not, right? You had Hamilton, urban, more centralized, Jefferson, decentralized, agrarian.
Yes.
The Federalist Papers are a big fight between a central government and distributed government. It was essentially trying to sort that out. And the interesting thing here is, okay, so here we are. One of the problems with the tech industry is we often think that everything happened in the last generation of software.
Yes.
So we're saying, well, we're trying to figure out who we is. Arguably, Aristotle was hard at work on that a while ago, but now this is the latest version of that. So here you are in Korea, and there are these tensions now between all of this new decentralized stuff, but also the state. And Korea, because it's been such a leader in this, has both of these tensions. You have a state that is both ambivalent and encouraging it. How is that all playing out?
Well, as a futurist,
Yeah,
there is
yeah.
a power shift.
Yeah.
Agricultural era, we had the religion as a power, and industrial era as a state, nation states, and information era, corporations. But now it's we call it conscious technology era, as well as a blockchain AI era, where individuals have a power, and individuals do not want to be controlled, do not want to be, centrally whatever the led to somewhere. They want to do their individual they want individual freedom, and they go for individualism, and that's what happens here in Korea. And even though United States are coming at heart to sort of demolish the North Korean nuclear whatever, they don't really care, and youngsters do not care. But we will work together, or we will do something together, and there are kind of mood here that I find it very interesting. Even today, I see 500 people trying to buy North Korean property here, right here in this building.
Okay, we have to interrupt because it's strange enough that we're talking about new forms of currency, but Young-Soo just mentioned North Korean property. Okay, so in this building, there's a blockchain conference going on, one of the largest in Korea, but there's also a conference...
GS Power Building, this one.
Yes, but there's also a conference going on about the land grab for the redevelopment of North Korea. What does this book say?
This book says, the North Korean policies on the real estate, measures and policies. So if you try to buy it, you have to buy it in Najin Songbong economic zone, where those properties are, listed here as prices.
Now, this is a book that would not have existed before January 1st, 2018. Actually, what impresses me most about this trip, okay, people say the Koreans move quickly on something, but seriously, right, the meeting between Trump and Kim happened about 2 weeks ago, and yesterday we were at the Blue House, and it's all about, well, we have to get ready for sending power and food up there. And I said, what about sanctions? And they said, well, that'll go away. And then we were with several members of parliament, and they're like, we have to do development and send solar power up there. Like, what about sanctions? And it's like, we have to get ready. That's fast.
Right. They don't want to hear us,
No.
We don't really think about sanctions.
Yeah, well, this is an interesting point about American power also. It's almost like the U.S. helped create the opening for this, but my sense is the Koreans are like, thank you very much, we can handle it from here. we're not so concerned about atomic bombs or anything else. So there's food to get up there and development to be done.
That's how I feel it, you know. As you know, I work for the British government, 20, and all these foreign governments for 30 years. I feel so strange that I'm in this Korea where people move so quickly, you know. Within 2 weeks, they are selling North Korean properties. And also, all these government officials are willing to send money, send food, send water, send energy, you know, switch. That's what they are so, you know, glad about seeing us.
We'll get back to North Korean property in a moment. But first, you know, when we talk about decentralization, it's always good to take a specific example. And Switch actually fits in here interesting. So globally, there's a fair amount of interest in reducing carbon and moving towards renewables. We know this because we have the Paris Accords and such. But at the same time, I think there's a realization that traditional global governance mechanisms don't work. Like at the World Economic Forum this year, their headline was, "The global commons can't heal itself." And they said, well, we've got good mechanisms for globalization, but poor ways of actually accomplishing that and meeting the UN development goals. It was a way of throwing up their arms and saying traditional political, legislator, climate accord mechanisms are too slow. Now, another interesting thing here is the way that we've used government to create the carbon markets, lots and lots of different, lots of local jurisdictions, but they're not fluid. So for example, California might give you an incentive to put solar in.
Sure.
And yet, in the middle of the day, that might not do any good. It might not even be useful. And yet, if that showed up in Puerto Rico or Africa or even in a part of the U.S. with coal, it would reduce carbon 7 times more because you'd be displacing diesel. But there's no way of connecting it up.
Sure.
So in a decentralized world, which is what Switch is, right? It's a token that awards the reduction of carbon, that rewards renewable energy. It gives you more token based on energy you create and carbon you reduce. The concept would be you take all these different markets and you hook them together in a way that could not be done centrally. So it's an example of decentralization at work, but also it's not like we're getting rid of governance. We actually agree as a people on a smart contract and how to get it done, but we kind of realize if you leave it to legislators and people like that, it's too slow. And also in a distributed world where you have lots and lots of little assets to hook together, these smaller decentralized ways of doing it would be a faster way to achieve a goal. So I'm wondering if that's kind of the pattern you see, and if you can kind of give us further illumination on how that kind of pattern, the kind of stuff we're doing here with Switch, is playing out across the landscape.
It's absolutely consistent with what I see as the broader vision for what I call open source money. And to me, one of the essential things that we're really talking about is borderlessness, right? So I think borderlessness is intrinsic, but I think beyond borderlessness, there's something that's very important that's happening with this concept of the commons, right? So I feel like what has happened with the commons is if you look inside of the GitHub repository, what you're going to see is you're going to see $1 trillion worth of free software written by people who are essentially volunteers, right? So it's an amazing achievement, and I think it's completely contravenes what economists would suggest about what happens normally, right? Which is what people normally expect, is they normally expect the tragedy of the commons. Yep. It's very well understood. When you have goat herders on an island, the central grazing zone is completely destroyed, right? However, when you look inside of GitHub, a completely volunteer decentralized organization has built $1 trillion of free software because they wanted to, right? So to me, open source money naturally eliminates externalities in a borderless way. And the reason it naturally eliminates externalities is that open source software has continuously since inception competed for consent. And if you have a cost without consent, that's actually a beautiful opportunity to get a user, right? And so to me, what we're going to see as open source money is increasingly penetrating the global financial system, is you'll see the multi-dimensionalization of externalities. So you're going to see coins that represent externalities. In the case of Switch, that externality is carbon emission, which I think is absolutely wonderful, because what is an externality? It's somebody somewhere getting screwed. And that energy of unscrewing that person is going to create a burst of energy from every single coin that tokenizes any externality.
You know, a lot of what you're describing is what Eleanor Ostrom won the Nobel Prize for. When she won the first woman to get the Nobel Prize for Economics, the Nobel Memorial Prize for Economics, for coming up with the concept of common pool resources, right? And part of what she said is that, well, Native people have often found ways of resolving things like fisheries and grain. But as we came into an industrial command and control economy, particularly when the only signal was price, when you couldn't have multiple coins or multiple mechanisms to, as you say, price and other externalities.
Unidimensionality.
Yeah, unidimensionality. So you did, okay, if the only thing was, it's like, if the only thing you have is a nail, it looks like a hammer. If the only thing you have is price, you end up with profit. Okay, and you play that out and you don't have something sustainable. So part of what we're doing is we're adding resolution, definition, more sensing because we have more sensors now. And because of that, then you can technically put in externalities and build consensus around it.
And back in the days, Paul Hawken was talking about the triple bottom line.
Yeah.
But why stop there?
Exactly.
Why do we need three? We can have an infinitely dimensioned space for an infinitely dimensioned world, which is inclusive to what we were just speaking of, which is self-sovereignty, right? Which is that people all have different values, right? And so those values can be reflected in the types of commerce that they choose to participate in, right? So what happens in a crypto economy that's multidimensionalized is that we then have an extremely healthy kind of Fritjof Capra style true ecosystem where one organism's waste is another organism's food, so you really end up with kind of closed loop systems and an ecology. So.
The poop cycle.
Yes, the poop cycle.
But the other thing you described here is, we were talking to Brock earlier, and so many people in crypto came out of gaming.
Yes.
And that's because this is about incentives. And there were really three signal events. 2006, the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics was won for mechanism design, for building a game, right? This was even carbon credits. You build a game such that people behave differently. Of course, 2007, that was just the first year of the cloud and the iPhone. The idea that this game could be played by consensus, not by government, that's new. 2000, that was 2006. 2008, I'm sorry, that was 2007. 2009 was the Nobel Prize for the Commons. And of course, what came between the two of them? 2008, Satoshi, who puts it all together. And what Satoshi says is, here's a game that sucks, in this case the financial system, and I have a solution for it, which is where Bitcoin comes in. But now, the power of mechanism design, the commons, and this new incentive mechanism, that's a pretty big deal. And that's kind of what motivates a lot of us with Switch. How are you finding that this whole bit of incentives, on the one hand, this can bring about great change, on the other hand, it can make an entire culture stay home and buy Bitcoin all day long, right? So you have kind of the significant portion of blockchain, and then you have the silly portion of blockchain. I feel like our industry's at a crossroads where, we're trying to support movements that really, are fundamentally more efficient ways or more powerful ways of accomplishing things, but just under the surface, there's still a lot of hype and silliness. And you're in the middle of this. How do you distinguish that, and where do you see this moment?
Well, I was going to ask you the questions. The thing that I find is that I talked to you about individualism, and people are powered by bitcoins and whatever. If they have money or some sort of a support system, they will not stick to a country like Korea. You get claustrophobic. It's a small country, and they regulate quite a lot of things, still. And people are looking, ahead and trying to move away from Korea. We know that I am the Korea representative of Big Nation, which is a nation, cyber nation, and there are some 20,000 people living in the cyber nation, Bit Nation, and as well as Seasteading Institute, Petri Friedman is leading, and all these people are now trying to establish countries, startup nations rather than startup companies. And small country like Korea, people in Korea are really interested in moving out, moving away, and experience something different, something big, something without any border, something without any North Korean, whatever the threats. And I see the sort of movement, and I see the small starting, such as some people trying to move to Puerto Rico or even Malta, or a lot of those people who are coming to me because I was experienced with the British government, some other governments, and they are asking me about visas and how many tax incentives and how many days they can live there without any visas and all that. I get many queries.
This is a remarkable set of tensions because we're talking about all of this openness, and yet one of the great global trends is populism and protection and closedness. We're at a time of enormous technological change, and so one reaction is to close, and we're all here very comfortable with rapid change and opening. And Mico, you travel all over the world and all over the U.S. There have to be significant pockets of either backlash or concern or schism growing.
Well, so I mean, if you kind of come into the root of it, right?
Yeah.
Like we are seeing really misplaced aggressions, right? In the sense that you are seeing automation, and you're seeing a lot of robotics, just the beginning really, and then we're seeing lots of pretty low-level process optimization governed by kind of goal-seeking intelligences, let's call them, right? So, those things are definitely taking jobs, right? And of course, it's easy for politicians to blame other countries, people of other countries, Mexicans, whatever it may be, and that's kind of almost a game, right? But I actually think that one thing to watch and be fearful of is that the internet is full of fake news, as we know, and that it's possible that this is even more part of what you were talking about before about game mechanics, right? Which is that there are state actors like Russia that we know and we have proof that they're manipulating electoral politics, right? So to me, that form of manipulation is actually quite dangerous from the perspective of the ability to create democratic systems that don't behave in their self-interest. So I think that Brexit is an example, and I can be, I think, firm in asserting that an island nation should not be disconnecting itself. That is against self-interest.
But this also points out in a moment of extreme decentralization, where you don't have editors and you don't have a control point, the possibility for a game you don't see or unintended to take off, to mature, is great. And if we go back in history, Plato, who argued for a philosopher king, or the knowledgeable class, or editors, or the East Coast elite, or whatever you want to call that actually performed a role because it kind of intercepted and controlled stuff. We're now kind of moving away from that, and one thing we see is, it's almost like creating a being that doesn't yet have an immune system. Until it goes through those, learns how to find antibodies and detect bad stuff and turn out state actors, you get kind of what's gone on for the last few years, which is an awful lot of people in an awful lot of places being played, right? So the early years of social media shows us the downside of living inside of a game.
Yeah, and I think that we're in a transitional period, so there's actually vulnerability right now, right? There's a tremendous vulnerability, and I think that people aren't reasoning terrifically about what has happened, right? Which is, for example, Satoshi Nakamoto solved the problem of third-party trust, but in fact increased problems that I like to think of as second-party trust, counterparty trust, and first-party trust, which is you don't even trust yourself to hold $1 billion worth of Bitcoin in a paper wallet, right? So I think that, to me, people aren't perfectly well reasoning about this emergent phenomenon and how it kind of impacts society, because I think in the long run, we may actually see an internet that's truth-based, based on kind of blockchain-based consensus, but I think we're still years away, and and I feel like people today are already kind of jumping the gun, and they're already making predictions that were already there, and I feel like those are dangerous because they really allow hacking, and they allow all kinds of like bad actors to penetrate our system.
Yeah, well, in retrospect, the goofiest thing about the internet is it was built assuming trust.
Oof.
Right? It's just built assuming trust because it's academics, we all work together, you know, and okay, fast forward to the big innovation with blockchain is how do you have trustlessness and restore this stuff? You're right, this is, you know, we're living in evolution in real time, which at times can be a little painful.
And, you know, tracing it back, you were just speaking with Brock Pierce,
Yeah.
you know, as we know, with his, you know, internet gaming company, with the World of Warcraft gold mining, you know, he introduced essentially Steve Bannon to the world of flaming and trolling and gamer behavior, which is in some ways almost like the toxic mirror of the kind of game environment, right? So the thing that's fascinating is how that culture could be exported to a news site, like a Breitbart, right?
Yeah.
So the thing that's astonishing is to actually see how these tropes have actually kind of been
That's a very interesting point,
self-perpetuating.
right? Brock took it into currency and
Yep.
Bannon took it into trolling. These are both examples of what to do with that superpower.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a very intriguing thing because the gamer behavior is smack talk, it's griefing, it's trolling, it's flaming, right? It's all of the above. All of these behaviors are essentially toxic human behaviors, but they're part of the limbic system, right? So because of the limbic system has inputs and it has outputs, right? Something that's fascinating is how you use that in the context of pre-existing vulnerable social networks to actually create behavioral outputs, right? And the behavioral outputs include things like voting, and includes things like voting out of your own self-interest, outside of your own self-interest, which is an amazing manipulation.
Yeah, and also when you're doing things in a very fast feedback cycle and you're being kind of amped, it's more limbic system, less reasoning, right? That would be turning on the TV or the internet these days.
Yeah, and the prefrontal cortex, as you know, is like it's as thin as a business card, and it sits far away from the spine where the behavior is emitted, right? So the limbic system sits in the middle. It's actually quite a big biomass, and it's generating most of the behavior, whether you like it or not.
Is it as toxic in Korea as we're finding back in the U.S. right now? You actually were describing something that was more communal earlier.
Oh, here in Korea, blockchain just arrived last year. I don't think, I mean, general public, we are their investors, of course, but more people are now realizing that blockchain is changing the world.
Yeah.
And they are now, this year, they're moving into blockchain technologies. And they are aware of follow my vote, you know, where they can just vote. That's a token blockchain system. And then Big Fury, they understand that Big Fury had signed with several countries to take over the government servant job to register all this land. And they can, you know, each person can, you know, type up something, and at the end, you don't have to pay any sort of registration fees and all these. That means, you know, those people who are working for the land registration can be just, you know, abolished and can go away. And there are many blockchain technologies now. They are researching and developing here in Korea. That move just started this year. It's not, you know, very old. And not as yet decentralization is the problem, or there are not many people thinking of decentralization at the moment. Just, you know, invest in tokens and get some more money.
Yeah.
And that's the mood, but now this year it starts changing. Blockchain technologies can change the world. That's the sense now.
Yeah, I think this is a tough transition, especially in this country, where people have been so programmed that if you put money in the morning, you can triple it in the afternoon. And it's there's a little bit of deprogramming, I think. That,
Yeah. Yeah, because of this sort of downturn this time, they are now learning that technology, blockchain technology is even better than, you know, just cryptocurrencies.
Yeah, which by the way was about our experience in like about 1999, 2000, right? Because the early .com. I mean,
That's right.
there's more speed and more zeros and more global now because there is the internet. But this was definitely what the first couple of generations of that looked like. Very interesting to talk to people who haven't been through all that and that like it's all for the first time.
Yeah, and I feel like this, which is that we undergone a period that I refer to as in the capital markets premature decentralization, and the mood there is that really what we haven't had is enough kind of regulatory control systems. The good news is we are seeing self-regulation, not from the perspective of all players becoming good actors or providing disclosures or any of these kind of formalized structures. What we're actually seeing is we're actually seeing a lot of late coming speculators that are actually just being naturally washed out of the ecosystem through the downturn. So I feel like the pendulum is organically swinging. It's a form of self-regulation. It's probably not the prettiest thing that you would see. I mean, it's a little bloody, but I would say that this downturn is a healthy thing for the long term, because if you do have a crypto economy that goes to the moon, there's actually no time to build products. It'll then crash and then you'll have nothing, right? So I do feel like a gentle downslope is actually beneficial because it provides a lot of runway and time. I mean, we've raised estimated between 9 and 23 billion, depending on who you ask, in ICO. That's all being built. Those are all projects. Those are all that's all runway and engineering. So we need time. We need time to build that stuff.
There was this concept in the early initial public offering era where you didn't want to show profit because suddenly then you have a PE. So profits were death. You didn't want to. It slowed you down, and it's almost now like you don't want to have a product because. Beyond that, but if you just have a white paper, it won't slow you down. The minute you actually have to deliver, we're getting over that. But that was the spirit of the book.
And it's such an immaturity because if you really study true angel investors with guts, right? If you study Jason Calacanis's book Angel, there's this whole concept of almost like heaven and earth, right? And earth is earthy, right? So it's like, what are you going to eat every day until the rapture happens and your company goes to heaven, right? So to me, I like a gritty answer. I like people who are saying, we're serving these customers and we know that that's not the biggest market in the world, but they're paying, so because it just proves that the entrepreneurs have guts and that they care about serving people.
By the way, sometimes you feel like the old guy that's like, I've been there before, but in fact, if you look at what's going on, you now have a lot of traditional VCs and institutional people coming in, and they're like, okay, we're going to come in, we're going to bring with us some ideas. There'll be governance, there might be a board, someone gets to make decisions.
That'd be great.
Also, it takes about 18 months to build a good product, so you actually have to do that. We're going to have a pilot cycle. So kind of also, I was talking to Steve Jurvetson about this, and his whole concept was there's something completely new about this decentralized, self-funding, trustless, you don't need a central mechanism. But then there's traditional values that maybe we forgot for the first 15 minutes. It's very important to bring those back, which institutional investors know a lot about. Is that happening here? Are we going more towards institutional investors? Still a very big retail community here, but this seems to be a moment that favors the more mature, long-term, even someone who can distinguish what a real software company looks like.
Yes, some small medium companies who are tech companies are really into this blockchain investment. But not as yet the large companies such as Samsung and Hyundai, because government is now still banning the ICO, and they cannot come out and say we have a blockchain, whatever, So they are hiding. However, they are investing quite a lot behind the scenes. Samsung has the largest blockchain researchers community at the moment, all this, but not yet out open. And the government, I hear the rumors that this September or even November they will establish something to allowing.
I love the
even
ambiguity.
ICO or make the whatever the cryptocurrency as a legal. Those are rumors. If that happens, there's a Korean Blockchain Association which is very powerful at the moment, is no longer powerful, and the government like FINMA in the Zouk,
Yeah.
they will play a good part. So there will be a transition, there will be a huge shift
Yeah.
coming to Korea in sort of November, December somehow. That if that happens, all these conglomerates will jump into
Switch
this
in,
market,
yeah,
yes, and regular sort of investment companies and all these opening will come into this market. So I see the wave going up at the moment.
And there are a lot of people who'd say that when this happens, you'll see a reconcentration because you'll see institutional money and big corporations. I mean, one of the interesting questions here is we're very idealistic about the beginning of the internet, very idealistic at the beginning of social media. It's now concentrated to 3 or 4 companies. And you see IBM or you see Samsung come in, and one of the great unanswered questions is, will this remain highly distributed for lots of we's, or will this concentrate in the way that many industries have concentrated? You worry about that?
So to me, since I'm an open source money maximalist, like I see open source as essentially being like some kind of a honey badger. So like in some sense, open source doesn't care what's being done. And in a sense, the internet is still the internet. So despite this kind of centralization, net neutrality, all these concerns, like without the internet, we couldn't really have kind of fat protocols for the internet of value, for money over IP, for Bitcoin, for all these open source monies. So to me, I feel like we're still in a very good spot, and that really what's happening with peak centralization is inevitable, right? Which is that essentially all of these forces are really just forces of nature, and they're forces of essentially human nature.
Yeah.
And the gravity of centralization is kind of shifted towards the gravity of self-sovereignty, of borderlessness, and of this kind of like freedom class, right? So now domiciles have to compete and be on the same playing field. Fiat currencies have to be in the same playing field as open source money, right? And so essentially like a country just becomes a platform, right? And then actually a class of actors that are moving now increasingly into this field are essentially like migrating to wherever suits best. So I think that's really, the trend line. And I think it's very hard for any of the machinations of centralized enterprises or authorities to actually stop that kind of force.
You know, what you're describing is nature itself.
Yes.
Nature wasn't centralized, highly decentralized, lots of cells, figured out how to cohere, build an organ, and build a system. And that's kind of where we're at right now. We're moving towards complex distributed natural systems, which is a difficult transition, but one that creates a lot of value, and which we as actors in it and architects in it have a real hand in kind of nudging it into what direction. We're the butterfly effect.
Absolutely. There's lots of kind of individual natures that are being fully expressed, but in aggregate, we're really just talking about nature itself.
We have to sum up. They
Speaking to you live from the state of nature, it's Mico, Youngsuk, and myself. Now,
Switch is very good platform, right? Could you explain for this ETM now platform is now
well, just to wrap up, so you know Switch is in the middle of its launch. And as we went live, our first customers in Europe have brought online about 3.5 gigawatts of production that's using Switch. So 3.5 gigawatts, about 100 times larger than anybody else in this space. But what it shows is a lot of support for it. So what they're doing is they realize in Europe that eventually EU subsidies and credits will come to an end. They have to build a system that is distributed. It's not so much private, but it's by consensus. So that's why they come out. In the US, Lend-Lease, which is a big it's an Australian company, but they build, operate, and sell utility scale solar. Okay, they actually administer the RECs and the credits that people use. It's incredibly manual these days. You know, it's self-reported, it's slow, so they're like, we like something that's automated, that's decentralized. But then there are also cities that are coming online, like Barcelona, that wants to incent more sustainable behavior. They want to measure it and they want to incent it. Well, that's a natural opportunity to work together, which is why we're kind of collaborating with them from the research point of view. So this has become a magnet to bring both development communities. For example, there's a collaboration going on with MIT and Yale to go build distributed power management capabilities, but also incent development communities to build the best algorithms. So Switch, in a way, is a community that brings all of that together because it's a movement that has to happen. And so I think the most gratifying thing is you launch it and a lot of energy aggregates around it.
Mm-hmm.
Anything you want to add to that?